Hello and welcome to the Extremis Publishing podcast. I'm Tom Christie. Today's topic is engaging with the challenge of different modes of writing, and I'm delighted to be joined for this discussion by Professor Joy Hendry. Professor Hendry is a highly respected cultural anthropologist. She completed a Bachelor of Science degree from King's College London in 1966 and a Bachelor of Letters degree at Lady Margaret Hall at the University of Oxford in 1974. She was awarded a Doctor of Philosophy degree from the same institution in 1979. She conducted much of her early research in Japan, initially studying family and marriage. She later moved to studying rearing practices for children before preschool, and then to subjects such as examining self-presentation and politeness in language. She later began a project studying diplomacy with the involvement of British and Japanese diplomats and the British Foreign Office. Joy has also worked in many other countries, including Nepal, Thailand, Indonesia and Tanzania, and has also served as a principal lecturer at Oxford's Brookes University. She's written extensively not only for academic publication, but has also produced non-fiction for general audiences, as well as novel-length works of fiction, and it's a great pleasure to welcome her today.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So Joy, thank you for joining us today. You've been the author of a great many academic papers and books over the years, but more recently you've also written for mainstream audiences. What would you say are the major challenges involved in these different modes of writing, and how do they differ?
It's a difficult question to answer because I don't think I ever quite achieved the academic form of writing that some of my colleagues practice. And because I started out, before I ever became an academic, I was a journalist. And so I was used to writing for general readers, and then became an anthropologist and started writing academic books, well, articles obviously first of all, and would get criticised for making things too easy to understand, which is, in my view, crazy. If you want people to understand what you're writing, whether they're academics or not, then you should write clearly. So I do have a sense of always wanting to write in such a way that anybody could understand what I've written. And even the most academic of the books I've written, people have actually thanked me for making them understandable. So, you know, I tried. Anyway, that's my view on the subject. But the problem is, I don't think I've achieved either getting back to writing in a more general way since I became an academic, because I have written these novels, but I haven't yet found anyone who wants to bring them to publication. And agents do say, you know, oh yeah, you academics, you might write lots of stuff, but it's different, just as you've suggested in your question. So I'm working on it.
Now, there is a huge market out there for what might be termed popular social science writing, as so many of these subjects are of perennial interest to the public. How do you feel the social scientist is best able to communicate complex ideas and theories to people who perhaps don't have an academic background in this area of study, and yet still convey the most important nuances of a given topic?
Yes, well, that is a challenge, but it's something that I've been working on all my life. So I do think that anyone could do it if they tried hard enough, and it's basically not couching all the things that you write in jargon that other people who are not academics can't understand. I think quite often academics do pepper what they're writing with the latest words that have been bandied around by each other, so that they seem to be writing as if only for each other. And if you can cut through that and write in a style that is clear and explains what you want to say, I don't think there's any problem with writing for anybody to understand, because all words that are used by the academics and that come into fashion and go out of fashion and become buzzwords, they have a meaning that can be explained. And even words that are quite difficult to explain, it is possible to do it. And I think that's what they need to do. There's one anthropologist who works for the Financial Times called Gillian Tett, and she's done a really good job of doing this, because she writes the most complex things in a way that people, and her books have sold really well.
Do you feel there are any specific challenges for the anthropologist in comparison to other particular disciplines such as, say, sociology?
Well, actually, one of our big problems in writing is that we're usually talking about people who have a different language. So, first of all, you've got to be translating what you've gathered in that other language into English, and then you also need to make sure that the people who are reading what you've written could include the people that you worked with if they know English. And so I think that is a different problem, because sociologists tend to work with their own language and their own culture, or at least part of their own culture. You know, it might be different people from the ones they grew up with, but they're usually using the language even if it isn't necessarily shared. And that's one of the things that anthropologists look at as well. So say you took a minority group of people in, let's say, Glasgow, who have their own way of talking that other people from outside don't understand, then an anthropologist would make the effort to understand that language and to not necessarily to use it because it might bring them, you know, they might be made fun of, but that's one of the things that anthropologists specialise in, which is learning another language and then translating it back. So that's our challenge in writing, to bring what we write into our own language and to the people who we want to read it.
You've been involved with writing in a number of different forms for a very long time. What would you say was the most difficult research project or piece of writing that you've produced throughout your career?
Yes, well, I did one study which you mentioned in the introduction of politeness, and that was a really difficult subject to discuss because a lot of what I was doing in Japan, and the same thing exists in the English language, is trying to understand things that weren't said, non-verbal communication, things that people mean without saying the words. So, you know, a simple example would be, that's a very beautiful hat, Mrs. Jones, you know, when you actually don't like the hat and Mrs. Jones knows perfectly well that you don't like it. That sort of thing that I was looking at in Japanese, and the Japanese professor who had invited me to visit his department while I was doing that research was convinced that nobody but Japanese people could understand Japanese. He thought that it was impenetrable for foreigners, and that he found foreigners speaking Japanese difficult to understand, he said. So that was difficult because it meant that I was running up against a prejudice about whether or not people would understand at the Japanese end, and then translating it back to explain, although we can do the same things in English, it's done in a different way. So that's probably the most difficult, because you're talking about non-verbal language and ways that people say things rather than what they say.
Yes, because Japanese seems to be so well known for having such a complex grammatical structure. I mean, is that something that's traditionally difficult for people to overcome, or you know, is it something that just has to be? Yes,
actually, that's a myth. The Japanese grammatical structure is not that difficult. It's fairly straightforward. What's difficult is, first of all, it's backwards. So if you take English and you want to write a sentence in Japanese, you generally need to start at the other end, or the Japanese word order is quite complex, but easy to get to grips with, because every word has a particle at the end of it which tells you what the word's doing. So instead of having noun, verb, subject, verb, object, you'd have a subject indicated by the particle at the end of the word, and it could be anywhere in the sentence. So that's confusing for people. But actually the grammatical form is not that difficult to learn. And what is difficult is the way you say things. So if you're too polite, it sounds rude. And men and women speak differently. People speak differently depending on who they're speaking to. And all those things, which we do in English, actually, as well, are hard for people to learn and to get right in a different society. And that's one of the reasons why I think anthropologists have done a really good job in Japan, because that's what they're looking at.
Over the past few years, you've moved into the fast-moving area of fiction writing. Did you find the research involved and the writing process more generally presented a different challenge from that of writing a non-fiction text, or were there still areas of overlap between these two modes of writing?
Well, there are definitely areas of overlap because whenever I'm writing, I want to be presenting what I'm saying. I want to do it right. I don't want to get things wrong or tell the story in a way that doesn't represent what happened or the period of time, because the novels I've written were set in the 1960s. I mean, actually, 70s, 80s, but I wanted to make sure what I was writing represented that period. And I'm also, when I'm writing academic books and anthropology, wanting to make sure I'm getting things right. So there's that overlap. But the research was much more fun because I could read what I wanted to read and not feel that people would be judging me for what I hadn't read. So when you're writing an academic text, you need to make sure you've read everything that anyone's written on the subject, and you need to be sure that you're getting the arguments right, and some of the people who are writing the arguments have written in such convoluted style that it's hard to understand. And so with the fiction writing, I was generally looking for... And I wrote to a lot of people who were around at the time I was writing about, and it was wonderful to get their replies and to get the first-person accounts, which is what anthropologists do anyway, because we go and talk to people while we're doing research. So I suppose that's another area of overlap, that we're getting first-person accounts. My anthropology is a bit historical now anyway, because I did it so long ago. So that's, and the research, and I just found it much more fun because I didn't have to have a pile of books around me and feel I've got to make reference to all these things and get all the references in the bibliography. I could just write and invent the world I wanted to invent. So that was good.
It does strike me that if you're writing about cultures beyond, the UK that we live in, anthropology seems to me one of the most advantageous subjects you could have a background in, because I think perhaps in terms of characterisation you will have a far, far better idea of how these cultures work, the specifics of them, than, say, someone like myself who would be learning from scratch.
Yes, that is the advantage of that subject, and it's one of the reasons why I'm really keen to sell the subject to schools in Scotland, which is one of the things I've been doing. And we've got making progress actually in that respect, because the newly designed Scottish Qualifications Authority is going to have anthropology as a named subject, which it hasn't had up to now. It's only been an option. So I think you're right. I think it is a good subject, and it'll help the people who leave school to work in all sorts of different areas where they're meeting people from different backgrounds.
It seems today there is considerable hybridisation emerging between different areas of academic study. I see it myself, for instance, in the growing cross-pollinisation between literary studies, film history and media studies. In what ways do you feel this development is presenting new opportunities for writers, and do you feel it has the potential to create entirely new emergent subject areas as a result?
Yes, actually it's not that new, because when I was a student many, many years ago studying anthropology, we were using some of the same theory that people in literary studies were using. So it's, for example, structuralism, symbolism, those sorts of things that we analyse in both areas, and the writers influenced each other. So Levi-Strauss, for example, was one of the people who influenced, and Saussure, who was a big man in language, influenced both fields. But what's been happening recently, and I think it's a good thing, is that there's been a move towards interdisciplinarity, I think is the word that academics would use for what you've called hybridisation. And actually the woman I mentioned before, Gillian Tett, who works for the Financial Times but has written really good books, she's written a book called The Silo Effect, and she's lauding the fact that people are now looking at each other's disciplines, because what she calls the silo effect is where people in one discipline are writing to each other, as I explained at the beginning, they're writing in language that only each other can understand, and then they don't put their discoveries across to other disciplines, or the general public readers as well. And her argument is also in favour of saying how well anthropology can contribute to all kinds of other disciplines. So I don't see another subject coming out of it, but having an interest in interdisciplinarity or sharing disciplines is something that students are being encouraged to do, to look across boundaries and try to make connections.
Yes, because when you mention that, I mean, I think of people like Svetlana Todorov and possibly people like Roland Barthes.
Yeah, definitely. Roland Barthes was definitely one of the characters who influenced across different fields.
Jean Baudrillard. That's who I'm looking for.
Yes, Baudrillard. Yeah, he was very influential. He influenced me, and they both did actually, in one of the books that I wrote. One of my favourite books that I wrote about theme parks and cultural display, because the copying and the creating of worlds that you could interpret in a spatial form, for example.
Yeah, and those discussions, I think, about simulation and simulacra have become so entrenched in this kind of postmodern world we live in now, because you see it often, certainly I've seen it in the last few years, in relation to augmented reality, virtual reality, how we may perceive reality. And as you say, it's fascinating to see how these theories, which have been laid down now for decades, are still, continuing to develop and be discussed.
Yes. You see, you used the words that they put out and that became well known actually in their cases, like simulacra, and I didn't. I said copying, and I said words that people understand, even if they've never heard of them before. So that's an example of what we were talking about at the beginning.
What advice would you offer someone who's coming anew to either academic writing or the craft of writing for a trade publishing audience? Do you feel the current market conditions are more competitive than in years past, or are the new developments in publishing helping to create a more inclusive environment for writers today?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it's always been difficult for writers to find the publisher that they want. But they're probably, I don't know. Look, I'm a writer who's trying to find a publisher for something I've written and haven't succeeded yet. Not you, because you don't publish fiction, but so it's a tough world. And the writers who've done, won Booker Prizes and who, spent years trying to find publishers are an example. I think in Scotland, writers, especially young writers, are given more support than other parts of the world. I was at an indie book fair in Oxford, which is basically people who publish their own work, so they're independent publishers. Is what indie's for, but it's mostly writers who decide to self-publish. But there was a publisher there, and she'd published the work of one of the people who was organising the gathering, and I told her that I'd written this novel or these novels, and would she be interested? And she said, yeah, I'd be interested. Let me have a look. She said, and when I said it was set in Scotland, part of it, she said, oh, you'll probably be better off trying to publish it in Scotland because publishers get more support there than we do. So I think probably in Scotland, and there are also quite a few things like retreats, aren't there, that people can go on and writing, sharing their writing with other writers. I've got a friend who came from Oxford to Scotland to attend such a thing and was telling me about it. So maybe you're talking about Scotland as much as other places. I don't know what it's like in other places really, but I have heard people telling those same stories from people from very different countries telling the same about how difficult it is to find a publisher. And yet, I just met by chance when I was in Oxford someone who'd had no problem whatsoever. So I think a lot depends on who you meet and who you talk to and chance. I mean, my first book that I ever published was my thesis, my anthropological thesis, and I got asked by a filmmaker to help them make a film in Japan about something that I'd studied for my thesis. And then the filmmaker was a woman whose brother was a publisher, and they were having Sunday lunch together and chatting about the film. And he got in touch with me and said, would you like to publish your book, your thesis as a book with us? And so, those kind of things you can't predict. Serendipity seems to play quite Serendipity, that's another word that... But luck and chance seem to play a part, don't they, in how people manage to find publishers. And I've had that happen over and again. So I also did some work which you didn't mention with First Nations and Indigenous people around the world. And I asked my existing publishers if they knew anyone who'd be interested, because I wanted to write them for a general reader rather than to be too academic. And it so happened that one of them had a friend in New York, and I wasn't anywhere near New York at the time, who was looking for something of that sort to publish. Kurdish woman, actually. So, it was just lucky.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, sometimes it just takes the most amazing strokes of luck to see a book out, because my very first book, oddly enough, arrived with the first publisher I ever worked with at exactly the same time as he was producing a large volume of his own on a similar topic. And there was no way of knowing that when I submitted it. I think at that point, statistically, you had a 1.1 million to 1 chance of a book being taken from a slush pile to be published without an agent. So, as you say, sometimes it just takes, blind luck to be there at the right time.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I also think that at the moment, certainly in England, from people I've spoken to, I don't know if this is true in Scotland as well, that the publishers are getting so many books coming through that even the agents, they only have time to look at the first sentence of what you send, to decide whether they're going to read any more. And I've got a good friend who actually, she's founded the publisher, which is now very well known, called One World. And One World has had Booker Prize winners and all sorts of really well-known authors. And we published an anthropology book with them, a colleague and I. So, and I know her, and she just, when I approached her, she said, "Joy, I just can't even look at it. I've got stuff coming in from agents," and she was just inundated, and that. I thought that might have been a good contact, but she just told me what the world was like.
Yeah, I mean, that's the amazing thing about Scotland, actually, is that the literary ecosystem here never stops. It seems to constantly develop and heads in interesting new directions all the time. I don't think there's... I'm sure there are other markets like it, but being here, it seems very exciting because you never really know what's going to come out in the next year, 2, 3 years beyond where you are at any given time.
You're in a good place.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you never know what the new trends are going to be. That's the beauty of it. So, thank you, Joy, very much for sharing your thoughts today about different modes of writing and about the books and publishing generally as an industry. It's been good to talk to you and to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to be able to talk to the last year's Independent Publisher of the Year.
Well, still until September. We're keeping our fingers crossed after that.
Oh, okay. Very good.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you also for listening. I hope that you'll tune in again soon.
Thank you.
If you would like to find out more about advertising on the Extremist Publishing podcast, please visit their website at www.extremistpublishing.com for details.